Colonialism, displaced morality, or strategic displacement, by Lucretia Talley. Colonialism is defined as the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. Oxford Dictionary. In word terms, it seems a lot like a typical form of imperialism. Colonialism is, in fact, an act of dominance and superiority, using a force that is usually politically or militarily backed to dominate over a territory that may be dependent upon said nation. But it also includes a population of their native people moving into the newly confiscated land with no intent of merging into it. The transients may still maintain an allegiance to their native land, politically speaking. Imperialism, on the other hand, only seeks to command the nation that they deem subservient and exerts its power through sovereignty, and not just to settle, but to only rule over. Colonialism is looked at as an act with great ethical and moral dilemma. Ethical issues arise from a consideration of the past interaction between colonizing and colonized peoples in the African region. People still debate if we quantify the justifications of colonialism with the effects it had on those people in those times. We debate if there's a justification for the colonialism or the people who suffered the brutalities for generations at the hand of colonialism. The history of modern-day colonialism began about 1500. Once the Europeans mastered how to navigate their way through the seas routes around the southern coast of Africa in 1488. With this and the mastered routes they already had to the Americas, the maritime powers shifted to the newly emerging nations of France, Portugal, Germany, Dutch Republic, Belgium, England, and Spain. Using claim discoveries, conquest, and eventually settlement, these nations broadened and colonized throughout their maritime masteries, institutionalizing and increasing the European culture. The scramble for Africa, which took place within a span of about 4 decades between 1880 and 1914, involved European nations invading, occupying, and colonizing Africa's territories. Although most of Africa was in fact colonized, 2 of the African nations still today are considered uncolonized. That would be Liberia and Ethiopia. The attempt to colonize Ethiopia in 1883 by the Italians was unsuccessful. They were defeated. But in 1936, the Italians did in fact eventually defeat the Ethiopians, and the Ethiopians regained control in 1941. So they actually were colonized for a very brief period of time, but they did in fact regain that, and they were the least colonized nations, with the exception of Liberia, who was technically colonized by the Americas in the entire African region. Spears versus guns. I only include this to just reiterate the fact that when you're speaking about taking over and dominating a land through your militarily or politically backed government, most of the African tribes were separate tribes. So they typically only defended themselves amongst one another. They didn't necessarily have a complete unified military, and they didn't have the weaponries that was needed in order to defend themselves. Back to colonialism. So when we're talking about colonialism, we're thinking about colonizing nations. But why do we colonize these nations? So are there real justifications to colonizing an entire nation of people? Not just an entire nation, but an entire continent. Are there really any real justifications to things such as genocide? Genocide is a form of massacre, or massacre is a form of genocide. Either way we look at it, we completely annihilate an entire group of people, an entire tribe of people, through either brutalization and killing them straightforward, or we take away their resources, take away their food, take away their ability to sustain themselves, and eventually starve them out. When we talk about justifications and for the colonization in Africa, A White Man's Burden by Kipling, 1889, Rudyard Kipling. It was a poem written by him, and it was an insinuation to a moral justification of the imperial colonization of nearly all of Africa as an actual term that you can find in a dictionary as the alleged duty of the white man, the colonizer, to care for the indigenous subjects, people of color, through their superior possessions. This poem also narrated a philosophy known as the three C's of colonialism: civilization, Christianity, and commerce. During the late 19th century, the European nations thought it was better for those in African nations to become more like them, civilized, but only in the captivity of servitude. Colonizers felt that those things that were unfamiliar to them, such as rituals, celebrations, worship, and traditions that they couldn't understand, were forms of savagery. They also felt as though it was beneath them, and that implementation of the European culture was a necessity. The why. Commerce. Commerce is and will always usually be the true driving force of the colonization for any indigenous people, no matter where. But in specifically Africa, the unexploited land in Africa was filled with many natural resources. That was a validation that they were once again needed to govern those who they deemed less than them by any means possible. Those reasonings were the basis of the invasion and raping of the African nation's natural resources. The genocide of the African people by the Germans specifically is said to be a precursor to the Holocaust. The white man's burden still heavily indicates that we hold a blurred justification of colonialism. Until as recently as 1994, we have watched from a distance as our African and European kin have suffered in apartheid. It was only in 1986 that we as the U.S. did anything to truly show our disgust in the matter. In 1986, Congress approved a law, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, imposing through U.S. economic sanctions against South Africa. President Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, actually vetoed it. But days later, lawmakers overrode his veto. Many African nations and its people have been displaced, stolen, sold, raped, tortured, killed, stripped of their identities, and stripped of the lands that they inhabited, which were filled with a multitude of natural resources. The ongoing debate continues as to whether or not the colonization of any one nation, or more so an entire continent, is ever justified. Africa has now become nations of growing economy and booming businesses. Some may claim that this success would have never happened or have been possible if it had not been for the education and the integration that occurred because of the colonization. Ethiopia has the fastest growing economy in Africa, according to CNN, as late as 2018. They are also in the top 5 fastest growing economies worldwide. The fact that Ethiopia has procured this level of success and was the only African nation that was never truly colonized could possibly challenge that belief altogether. Thank you.